In this video, we're going to create the geometry and the texture for this Cocoabag. To start, I've introduced the templates that will allow me to create the basic geometry for the bag. I'll go to my orthographic views, and if I look at the template, I'm going to start by creating a polygon cube. I'll go to Create, Polygon, Primitives, Cube. I'll drag the shape of the larger rectangle on the left, and then I'll go to my perspective window to start working on a width. Now the width is going to be defined by the narrower rectangle that we see on the template. So I'll go to my orthographic views again, and if it's selected, I can now go in and I can refine that. So I'll grab the vertices to do this, and I'll just tweak them out so they are the same size of the narrow rectangle on the left in this viewport. I'll hit 5 on the keyboard. I'll go back to my object mode. Now I don't need the template anymore, so I'll turn it off in my layer window. Now if we look at the finished bag on the left, you can see it's been broken up into a number of polygon faces. It's actually 16 faces per side. So to do that, I'll select my geometry, I'll hold down the space bar, and I'll go to Edit Mesh, Add Divisions, and the Attributes. And if I set the division level for 2, it will give me those extra faces all around the geometry. Now if we look at the finished bag, you'll see there's only one edge though defining the sides. So we're going to get rid of those edges that we won't need to get the shape we want. I'll right click and choose Edge, and if I start with one of the vertical edges over here, we're going to keep the middle one. I'll double click and it'll take the whole edge around the entire length of our box. I'll hold a shift and double click on this one, and if I would hit 4 on the keyboard, we can see it's been selected all the way around. I'll hold down the Command or Control key depending on your platform, and I'll hit delete, and I'll save. I'm going to return to my object mode, and I'll delete by type history. Now if we look closely, there's a bevel that falls around the perimeter, so that it kind of emulates folded paper that we'd see in a bag. So to do that, we're going to select the edges around the perimeter. Once again, I'll hold down the space bar and I'll choose Edge. And if I select this edge here and double click, it'll get the whole edge for me. So I'm going to go around and do that around the perimeter, holding the Shift key. And then I'll go down the sides, doing the same, and I'll do the bottom. I'll hit 4 on the keyboard to make sure I haven't selected edges that I don't want. Holding down the space bar, I'll go to Edit Mesh, I'll go to Bevel, and I'll go to the Attributes. Now I've set the bevel width to 0.15 and the segments to 2, and I'll hit Apply. I'll close out the bevel options, and I'll right click and choose Face. We don't need the top faces. You can see the bag is open here. So I'll hold the Shift key and select these. And if I do a clean selection on a basic piece of geometry, I can now hold down the Shift. If I hit the period key, it will go out and get consecutive bands of polygons. So I'm going down and essentially getting rid of the top and the bevel as well. So once they're selected, they'll be brown. I'll hit delete, and I'll return to my object mode, and I'll save. Delete by type history. Before we actually start to shape the bag, more like the one over on the left, we need to define the UV map for our texture. With my geometry selected, I'll delete by type history, and I'll click on Freeze Transforms. I'll hold down my space bar, and I'm going to UVs, and I'm going to choose Automatic. I'll deselect my geometry and right click and choose Object Mode. With it selected, I'll go to my UV editor. And now in my UV editor, I can see the pieces have been broken down proportional to the faces of that open polygon cube that we've created. The next thing we want to do is sew these together. In my UV editor, I'll hold down my right mouse, I'll choose Edge, and I'll select all the edges on the left. Now I'm being careful not to select the bevels down here. It doesn't make any difference about the faces or the edges you see on the inside, as long as you get that outside edge. Now to sew a piece of the UV map to this, I will go to Cut and Sew, and I'll choose Move and Sew. And I'll continue to do that. I'll select these edges, and either I'll hit G or I'll go to Cut and Sew and choose Move and Sew. I'll select these edges, I'll hit G, and then I'll put the bottom, one of the larger faces, the front or the back of what the bag will be. I'll select along the bottom, and I will click on Move and Sew or hit G on the keyboard, and now I have the UV shell that I need. I'll right-click and choose UV shell, and I'll select the entire shell and I'll put it in that quadrant where the UV map will be generated for Photoshop. Now, just to make sure that I've got the right quadrant here, you'll see that everything converges to a 0. And the one in the right-hand corner here is the one that will go into Photoshop. Now I'll return to my viewport and making sure my geometry is in the object mode and not in an editing mode. I can now go to the UV editor, and under Image I'll choose UV Snapshot. I'll save it into my folder, and I'll set the image format to a PNG, and in this instance I'm going to make the size 2000, and I'll hit return, and I'll click on apply and close. Now I'm going to Photoshop and I'm going to apply the texture so that as we refine the edit we can see how it affects the texture.